Hi, I'm Rachel, and I used to believe that keeping the peace meant swallowing your pride. I thought being the bigger person meant letting others walk all over you with a smile. But on Easter Sunday, when my sister Victoria stood in my living room and called my home a pathetic dump in front of our entire family, something inside me finally snapped. What she didn't know was that the distinguished man quietly observing from my kitchen doorway wasn't just a random guest. He was about to change everything, and when he finally spoke up, the words that came out of his mouth left my sister speechless and me vindicated in ways I never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Easter in the Torres family, which meant it was destined to be a disaster wrapped in pastel colors and forced smile. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror in my converted studio apartment in Southeast Portland, applying mascara with hands that trembled slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The exposed brick walls of my 1920s building caught the early morning light streaming through the tall windows, casting everything in a warm golden glow that usually made me feel grateful for this little sanctuary I'd carved out for myself. But today was different. Today I had to face Victoria. My sister had called 3 days earlier with that particular tone she reserved for delivering commands disguised as invitations. "Rachel, you're coming to Mom and Dad's for Easter brunch, right? The whole family will be there, and I'm bringing Marcus and the kid." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her mentally calculating how to phrase her next words for maximum impact. "Oh, and we're all meeting at your place first for mimosas. I want to see this apartment you're always posting about on social media." The way she said it made my skin crawl. Victoria had a gift for making genuine enthusiasm sound like delusion, and my pride in my modest home suddenly felt foolish. But I'd agreed because that's what I always did. I kept the peace, I played along. I pretended that her backhanded comments didn't slice through me like paper cut. As I finished getting ready, I surveyed my studio apartment with fresh eyes, trying to see it through Victoria's lens. The space was small, sure, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen from thrift stores and estate sales. The vintage leather armchair I'd found at a garage sale and lovingly restored. The dining table made from reclaimed wood that a local artisan had crafted. The gallery wall of photographs I'd taken during my weekend explorations of Oregon's forests and coastline. To me, it was a haven of creativity and independence. To Victoria, I knew it would be evidence of my failure to thrive. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Victoria lived in a sprawling McMansion in Beaverton with her lawyer husband Marcus, complete with a 3-car garage and professionally landscaped yard, she'd never actually paid for any of it herself. Her real estate career was more hobby than profession, yielding maybe 2 sales a year while Marcus funded their lifestyle of private school tuition and luxury vacation. Meanwhile, I'd scraped together every penny for my deposit, painted every wall myself, and felt genuine pride in what I'd built from nothing. But Victoria had always possessed the supernatural ability to make me question my own reality. Growing up, she was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the weird artsy kid who took pictures instead of playing sports and preferred books to parties. Our parents, Robert and Linda, weren't cruel, but they were overwhelmed by Victoria's demanding personality and found it easier to give her what she wanted than deal with her tantrums. I learned early that keeping quiet and staying out of the way was the path of least resistance. Now, at 28, I was a successful digital marketing manager at a boutique agency downtown, making good money and living independently. But around my family, I still felt like that awkward teenager desperately trying to prove she belonged. The knock on my door came precisely at 10:30, because Victoria was nothing if not punctual when it served her purposes. I opened it to find her standing there like she was posing for a magazine cover. Blonde hair, perfectly styled, designer Easter dress that probably cost more than my rent, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eye. Behind her stood Marcus, looking uncomfortable in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, and their 2 kids, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Tyler, who were already sticky with chocolate from what I assumed was an Easter morning sugar binge. "Rach," Victoria air-kissed me, her perfume overwhelming in the small entryway. "Happy Easter, honey." Oh my goodness. It's so. Marcus nodded politely and mumbled something about traffic while the kids immediately began touching everything within reach. I watched Madison grab one of my vintage ceramic vases and felt my chest tighten. Can I get you guys some mimosa? I made fresh orange juice, I offered, trying to channel the gracious hostess energy that Victoria seemed to effortlessly embody at her own gatherings. That would be lovely, Victoria said. But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were scanning my apartment like a real estate agent evaluating a property, and I could see the mental notes being taken. Her gaze lingered on the slight water stain on the ceiling from last winter's leak, the vintage radiator that clanked sometimes, the mismatched chairs around my small dining table. As I moved to the kitchen area to prepare drinks, I could hear her stage whispering to Mark. I had no idea it was this small. How does she even entertain? And that wall color is so bold. The wall color was a warm terracotta that I'd agonized over for weeks before finally painting. It made the space feel intimate and sophisticated, at least to me. But hearing Victoria's critique made me second-guess everything about my choices. I was pouring champagne when the soft knock came at my door. Confused, I set down the bottle and went to answer it, assuming one of my neighbors needed some. Instead, I found myself face to face with David Chen, the building owner, holding a small potted orchid. Rachel, hi, he said with that gentle smile I'd grown familiar with over the past year of living here. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I wanted to drop this off as a small Easter gift and thank you for being such a wonderful tenant. David was in his early 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an understated elegance that spoke to his background as an architect. He'd bought the building 2 years ago and had been slowly and carefully renovating it, preserving its historic character while updating the essentials. Unlike the previous slumlord who'd owned the place, David actually cared about his tenants and the community he was creating. Oh, David, that's so thoughtful, but you didn't need to, I started, but Victoria's voice cut through from behind me. Rachel, who is that? Don't leave us hanging over here. I felt heat rush to my cheeks. I'm so sorry, David. My family is here for Easter and we're just about to head out. But thank you so much for the orchid. It's beautiful. David's expression shifted slightly as he glanced past me into the apartment, where Victoria was now holding court, her voice carrying as she gestured dramatically. You know what? Why don't I just set this inside for you real quick? I'd hate for it to sit in the hallway. Before I could protest, David stepped into my entryway, and I had no choice but to close the door behind him and introduce him to my family. Everyone, this is David Chen. He owns the build. David, this is my sister Victoria, her husband Marcus, and their children Madison and Tyler. Victoria's demeanor changed instantly. Her real estate instincts kicked in, and she extended her hand with the practiced charm she used on potential clients. How wonderful to meet you. I'm in real estate myself, so I always love meeting property owners. This is such a unique building, very historic. Again, that word choice, unique, the way she said it, sounded like a polite substitute for problematic. David shook her hand politely and accepted the mimosa I offered him, though I could tell he was picking up on the strange energy in the room. It is historic, he agreed. Built in 1923, originally designed as artist studio. I've been working to restore it to its original character while adding modern conveniences. How fascinating, Victoria said, but I could see her gears turning. And the units are all this size? They vary, David replied, looking around my space with what seemed like pride. Rachel has one of my favorite units actually. The light exposure is spectacular, and she's done such beautiful work with the space. I always point to this apartment as an example of how historic charm and modern living can coexist perfectly. I nearly choked on my mimosa. Victoria's smile became slightly more strained. Oh yes, she said, her voice taking on that particular pitch it reached when she was building up to something. Rachel has certainly made the most of what she has to work with. Marcus shot her a warning look, but Victoria was just getting started. She'd had 2 mimosas now, and alcohol had always lowered her filter. I mean, it's very artistic, she continued, gesturing around the space. Very bohemian. Though I have to say, Rachel, I'm a little concerned about you living like this long term. Don't you want something more substantial, more grown up? The room went quiet except for the kids, who were now playing with their tablets in the corner. I felt that familiar heat of embarrassment and anger mixing in my chest, but I forced my voice to stay level. I like my apartment, Victoria. It suits me perfectly. Oh honey, I'm not criticizing, she said with a laugh that somehow made it worse. I just worry about you. Living in this tiny space, all alone, surrounded by all this. She waved her hand vaguely at my carefully curated belongings. Stuff. It just seems so isolating, so limiting. David had gone very still beside me, his mimosa forgotten in his hand. I could feel him watching Victoria with the intense focus he usually reserved for architectural problems. I mean, Victoria continued, warming to her theme now, when Marcus and I were your age, we were already thinking about building equity, planning for the future. This place is charming for what it is, but let's be honest, it's basically a glorified dorm room, and the neighborhood, she shuddered theatrically. I had to drive past 3 homeless camps just to get here, Victoria. Marcus's voice held a clear warning now, but she was too far gone to heed it. What? I'm just being honest. Families should be honest with each other, right? Rachel, you're 28 years old. Don't you think it's time to stop playing house and start building a real life? This whole artistic struggling thing is fine for your early 20s, but at some point, you need to grow up. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at my sister, feeling like I'd been slapped. All the old feelings came rushing back. The constant sense that I wasn't enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't living the right kind of life according to her standards. But then, David set down his mimosa glass with a soft clink that somehow commanded attention. I'm sorry, he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone turn toward him. I couldn't help but overhear, and I feel like I need to say something. Victoria looked surprised to be interrupted, but she was too well-bred to be openly rude to a property owner she'd just met. Of course, she said with a tight smile. David looked directly at her, then at me, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. Victoria, is it? I have to tell you, in my 25 years of architecture and property development, I've seen a lot of living spaces, and I can say without hesitation that your sister has created something truly special here. Victoria's smile became even more strained. Well, that's very kind of you to say. I'm not being kind, David continued, his voice gentle but firm. I'm being accurate. This building has 12 units, and I handpick my tenants very carefully. Do you know why I chose Rachel? The question hung in the air. Victoria clearly didn't know how to respond. Because, David continued, when she applied to live here, she didn't just fill out the standard rental application. She wrote me a letter about what this space meant to her, how she envisioned living here, how she wanted to honor the building's history while making it her home. She included photographs of her previous apartment, showing how she'd transformed a bland corporate rental into something alive and beautiful. I felt my cheeks burning, but for a different reason now. I remembered writing that letter, staying up late crafting it, because I'd fallen in love with the apartment the moment I'd seen it, and was desperate to convince David to choose me over the dozens of other applicants. And look what she's done. David gestured around the space. She's honored every original detail while adding her own vision. Those built-in bookshelves, she refinished them herself after finding them damaged in the basement. That light fixture, she found it at an antique store, and had it professionally rewired to be period appropriate. The paint colors, the furniture arrangement, the way she's maximized natural light, it's all thoughtful, intentional, and beautiful. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. But more than that, he said, his voice taking on a warmer tone. Rachel isn't just a tenant, she's a community member. She organizes the building's monthly potlucks. She waters her elderly neighbor's plants when he travels. She's the one who suggested and helped implement the community garden in our courtyard. She's exactly the kind of person who makes a building into a home, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. I felt tears prick my eye. I had no idea David had noticed any of those things, let alone valued them. So when I hear someone dismiss this apartment as a dump or suggest that Rachel needs to grow up, David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. I have to wonder what kind of success we're actually measuring. Because from where I stand, Rachel has created exactly the kind of life that most people spend years trying to achieve, one that's authentic, community-minded, and full of beauty. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Victoria's face had gone through several shades of red, and Marcus was staring at his shoes, like he wished he could disappear into them. The kids, oblivious to the adult drama, continued playing their games. Victoria started, then, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, she seemed genuinely speechless. David turned to me with a smile that was much warmer than the one he'd given Victoria. "Rachel, I hope you know how much I appreciate having you here. This building is better because of tenants like you." Then he turned back to Victoria, and his expression grew more serious. "As for the neighborhood, I think you might be letting some assumptions cloud your judgment. Southeast Portland is one of the most vibrant, creative communities in the city. The people you're dismissing as homeless, many of them are veterans, families who've been priced out of their homes, people dealing with mental health challenges that our society has failed to address adequately. This neighborhood rallies around each other in ways that many wealthier areas never do." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "I didn't mean," and as for building equity, David continued, "I happen to know that Rachel has been saving steadily while living here. But even if she wasn't, the idea that a home's value is only measured in property appreciation is pretty limiting, don't you think? Some of us believe that a home's value comes from how it nurtures the person living in it, how it connects them to their community, how it allows them to become their best self." He glanced around the apartment one more time, his architect's eye taking in details that I was sure Victoria had missed. "This space does all of that for Rachel, and honestly I've seen plenty of expensive houses that felt cold and empty despite their price tags." The implication hung heavy in the air. Victoria's face had gone pale now, and I could see her struggling between her instinct to fight back and her realization that she was completely outmatched. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice careful and diplomatic. "We should probably head to Mom and Dad's house. They're expecting us soon." Victoria nodded quickly, clearly eager to escape what had become a very uncomfortable situation. She began gathering her purse and corralling the children, her movements sharp and brittle. "Yes, of course," she said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "David, it was educational meeting you." David nodded politely. "Likewise. I hope you have a lovely Easter with your family." As Victoria herded her family toward the door, she paused and looked back at me. For just a moment, I saw something vulnerable in her expression, something that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with before competition and insecurity had built walls between us. "Rachel," she said quietly, I'll see you at Mom and Dad." And then they were gone, leaving David and me alone in my suddenly very quiet apartment. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I'd just survived a tornado. My hands were shaking slightly as I began collecting the abandoned mimosa glasses. "Rachel," David said gently, "are you okay?" I looked up at him, this man who had just defended my home and my choices with more passion and eloquence than I'd ever managed myself, and felt something crack open in my chest. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think so. That was intense," David finished. "I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I couldn't just stand there and listen to someone tear down what you've built here. It wasn't right."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I set down the glasses and really looked at him, perhaps for the first time, seeing him not just as my landlord but as a person who had chosen to stand up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. "You didn't overstep," I said. "You said things I've been trying to find the words for my whole life. I've never had anyone defend me like that before." David's expression softened. "Well, you should have. What you've created here, Rachel, not just the apartment, but the way you live in the world, it's something to be proud of. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As I looked around my apartment through his eyes, I felt something shift inside me. The space that had felt diminished and shameful under Victoria's scrutiny now felt sacred again, worthy of protection and pride. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. David smiled and moved toward the door. I should let you get to your family dinner, but Rachel, don't let today dim your light. The world needs more people who create beauty and community wherever they go. After he left, I stood alone in my apartment, still processing everything that had happened. The orchid he'd brought sat on my kitchen counter, its delicate purple blooms catching the afternoon light streaming through my windows. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly seen and valued for who I was, not who someone else thought I should be. And as I prepared to face the rest of Easter dinner with my family, I carried that feeling with me like armor. The confrontation with Victoria was far from over, I knew. But something fundamental had shifted. David's words had planted seeds that were already beginning to grow, and I had the distinct feeling that I was about to stop apologizing for the life I'd built and start celebrating it instead. As I grabbed my keys and headed out to face whatever came next, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me stood a little taller, smiled a little brighter, and looked remarkably like someone who finally understood her own worth. The rest of this story was just beginning. The drive to my parents' house in the Hawthorne district felt different this time. Usually I spent the 20-minute journey mentally preparing myself for Victoria's subtle digs and my parents' well-meaning but misguided attempts at family harmony. Today, though, I found myself replaying David's words like a protective charm, feeling their truth settle into my bones in a way that surprised me. I pulled into the familiar driveway of the modest craftsman house where I'd grown up, its yellow paint, slightly faded, but the garden still meticulously maintained by my mother's obsessive care. Victoria's pristine white SUV was already there, parked at an angle that somehow managed to take up more space than necessary. I sat in my car for a moment, watching through the front window as shadows moved around inside, and tried to summon the energy for whatever was about to unfold. The front door opened before I could even knock, revealing my mother Linda in her favorite Easter dress, a powder blue number she'd been wearing to holiday gatherings for at least 5 years. Her smile was bright but strained, and I could see the worry lines around her eyes that had become more pronounced since Dad's retirement last year. Rachel, honey, there you are. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and anxiety. How was the mimosa gathering? Victoria said you had a lovely time. I wondered exactly how Victoria had described our morning encounter, but I simply hugged Mom back and said, it was interesting. The living room was decorated in Mom's typical Easter style, pastel flowers everywhere, and enough chocolate bunnies to stock a small candy store. Dad sat in his recliner, reading glasses perched on his nose, as he scrolled through something on his tablet. Probably sports scores or political articles that would later fuel dinner table debates no one really wanted to have. Hey Dad, I said, kissing his cheek. He looked up and smiled, the genuine warmth there that had always made me feel like at least one parent truly saw me. There's my photographer, he said, using the nickname he'd given me when I'd gotten my first camera at age 12. How's the apartment treating you? Still love that old building. Before I could answer, Victoria emerged from the kitchen carrying a casserole dish, her earlier discomfort replaced by what appeared to be carefully constructed nonchalance. She'd changed clothes since our apartment encounter, trading her designer Easter dress for a more casual but still expensive-looking outfit that somehow managed to make everyone else feel underdressed. Oh good, Rachel's here, she announced to the room in general. I was just telling Mom and Dad about your charming little place. So unique. There was that word again. I felt my jaw tighten, but David's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me that my home was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Thank you, I said simply, refusing to take the bait. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she'd expected me to deflect or minimize. And we met your landlord, which was quite the surprise. He certainly had some strong opinions about urban living. Marcus, who had been helping the kids set up an Easter egg hunt in the backyard, glanced through the sliding door with an expression that suggested he was hoping to stay outside for the duration of whatever this was becoming. David's not just my landlord, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. He's an architect who specializes in historic renovation. He's actually quite brilliant at what he does. Oh, I'm sure he is, Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eye. It's just interesting how invested he seemed in defending your lifestyle choices, almost like he felt personally responsible for them. The implication in her tone was clear, and I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest. But instead of the usual shame and defensive anger, something else kicked in, something that felt suspiciously like clarity. "Victoria," I said, setting down my purse and turning to face her fully. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Mom looked between us with the expression of someone watching a pot that might boil over at any second. "Girls, it's Easter. Can we please just have a nice family dinner?" "Of course, Mom," Victoria said sweetly. "I'm just making conversation about Rachel's new friend. I think it's wonderful that she's found someone who appreciates her artistic sensibilities." Dad looked up from his tablet, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Victoria, what's gotten into you today? You're being unusually sharp." "I'm not being sharp, Dad. I'm being realistic." Rachel's 28 years old, living alone in a studio apartment with no prospects for advancement, no romantic relationships that last longer than a few months, no real plan for her future. As her sister, aren't I allowed to be The words hit like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at my deepest insecurities. But instead of crumbling, I found myself thinking about David's words, about the way he'd seen value in choices that Victoria dismissed as failures. "My prospects for advancement," I repeated, my voice getting stronger. "Victoria, I'm a senior marketing manager at one of Portland's most successful boutique agencies. I've increased my salary by 40% in the last 2 years. I have a robust savings account, excellent credit, and a career I'm passionate about. What exactly do you think I need to advance toward?" Victoria's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well, yes, your job is fine, but what about the bigger picture? Marriage, children, a real home." "You mean a home like yours?" The words came out before I could stop them, and suddenly the room felt electric with tension. "What's that supposed to mean?" Victoria's voice had an edge now that suggested I'd hit something tender. "It means," I said, feeling reckless and liberated in equal measure, "that you've spent the last 10 years defining success as looking like your life, without ever questioning whether your life is actually successful or just expensive." "Rachel," Mom said sharply, but I was beyond stopping now. "You want to talk about prospects and plans? Let's talk about them. You sell maybe 2 houses a year while Marcus funds your entire lifestyle. You spend money you didn't earn on things you don't need to impress people you don't even love. Your kids are raised by nannies because you're too busy maintaining your image to actually parent them. And you live in a house so big and sterile that you can't find anything real to hold on to when life gets difficult." Victoria's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. "How dare you?" "I dare, because you've spent the entire day tearing down my life, my home, my choices, without once considering that maybe, just maybe, your way isn't the only way to live." I was standing now, though I didn't remember getting up. "You called my apartment a dump, Victoria." "My home, the place where I feel most myself, most creative, most at peace. You dismissed it as childish and inadequate, without understanding that it represents everything I've worked for and everything I value." Dad had set down his tablet and was watching us with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly challenging crossword puzzles. Mom looked like she wanted to crawl under the coffee table. "You're being dramatic," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "And because from where I stand, you're the one being dramatic. You drove across town to my apartment specifically to judge it, then spent the morning making snide comments about my lifestyle to a virtual stranger. That's not sisterly concern, Victoria. That's something else entirely." "What are you implying?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been missing for years. Beneath the designer clothes and perfect makeup and carefully constructed superiority, Victoria looked tired. More than tired, she looked scared. "I'm not implying anything," I said more gently. "I'm saying it outright. You're threatened by the fact that I'm happy with less than what you think you need to be happy. You're threatened because I've built something real and meaningful without following your blueprint for success. And you're especially threatened because someone like David, someone successful and accomplished, can see the value in what I've created." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 2 rooms away. Victoria sat down heavily on Mom's floral couch, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "You think you know everything, don't you?" "No," I said, sitting back down myself, suddenly exhausted by the adrenaline crash. I don't think I know everything, but I know myself. And I know that tearing me down doesn't make you taller. Marcus chose that moment to slide open the patio door, probably having heard raised voices and decided it was safe to return. The kids tumbled in behind him, chocolate on their faces and grass stains on their Easter outfits, completely oblivious to the emotional minefield they were entering. "Everything okay in here?" Marcus asked carefully, his lawyer instincts clearly picking up on the tension. "Everything's fine," Victoria said quickly, but her voice was shaky. "Rachel and I were just having a discussion about life choices." "Mommy, why do you look sad?" Madison asked with the brutal honesty of children everywhere. Victoria's carefully maintained facade cracked a little more. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Mommy's just tired." But I could see that she was sad, and suddenly I understood something that had been hidden beneath years of sibling rivalry and hurt feelings. Victoria wasn't happy. For all her material success and picture-perfect family, she was desperately, profoundly unhappy, and my contentment with less than what she had wasn't just threatening to her worldview, it was highlighting everything that was missing from her own life. Dad cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "You know," he said in the measured tone he'd used throughout our childhood to diffuse arguments, "I've been thinking a lot lately about what success actually means." We all turned to look at him, grateful for any distraction from the emotional wreckage scattered around the room. "When I was your age," he continued, addressing both Victoria and me, "I thought success meant climbing the ladder as fast as possible, accumulating as much as I could, making sure everyone knew I was doing well. And I did that, for the most part. Good job. Nice house, provided for my family." Mom reached over and took his hand, a small smile crossing her worried face. "But you know what I realized when I retired? The things I was proudest of weren't the promotions or the salary increases, or the size of our house. They were the small moments. Teaching Rachel how to use her first camera, watching Victoria win her high school debate championships, the time we all got snowed in and spent 3 days playing board games and telling stories." He looked directly at Victoria, then at me. "Success isn't about having more than someone else or living up to someone else's expectations. It's about building a life that feels true to who you are, and brings something good into the world." Victoria was staring at her hands, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I just wanted Rachel to have more," she said quietly. "I wanted her to have security, stability, a future that wasn't so uncertain." "But Victoria," I said gently, "I do have those things, just not in the way you recognize. How can you have security in a rental apartment? How can you have stability without someone to share your life with? How can you have a future without planning for marriage and children and building wealth?" The questions came out in a rush, and I realized they weren't really about me at all. They were about her own fears, her own doubts about the choices she'd made. "I have security because I live within my means and save money every month. I have stability because I've built a career I love and a community that supports me. And I have a future because I'm creating it every day, based on what actually makes me happy, not what I think is supposed to make me happy." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Victoria, when was the last time you felt truly happy? Not satisfied with your accomplishments or proud of your acquisitions, but genuinely, deeply happy." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she was clearly fighting to hold back. He started, then stopped. "I don't know." Marcus moved closer to his wife, his expression concerned. "Vic, what's going on?" "Nothing," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "I'm just being silly. Easter makes me emotional." But it wasn't nothing, and we all knew it. Something was shifting in the room, some long-held dynamic finally beginning to crack. Mom, who had been silent through most of our exchange, finally spoke up. "Victoria, honey, you've seemed so stressed lately. Is everything okay at home?" The simple question broke something open in Victoria. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, and suddenly, she looked less like the polished, successful woman she presented to the world, and more like the scared little girl she'd once been. "I don't know," she whispered. "I thought I was doing everything right. I thought if I just followed the plan, if I just achieved all the right milestones, I'd be happy. But I'm not. I'm tired all the time, and I don't feel connected to anything real." And I look at Rachel living in her tiny apartment, and she seems so much more content than I've ever been. The admission hung between us like a bridge, neither of us was sure how to cross. That's why you came to my apartment today, I said, understanding finally dawning. You weren't trying to tear me down. You were trying to understand how I could be happy with so much less than what you think you need. Victoria nodded miserably. And then your landlord started talking about what you'd built there and how intentional everything was, and how you were part of a community, and I realized that for all my square footage and expensive furniture, I don't have any of that. I don't even know my neighbor's name. Marcus sat down beside his wife and pulled her into his arms. Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way? Because you work so hard to give us the life we have. I didn't want you to think I was ungrateful. Vic, I work hard because I thought that's what you want. If you're not happy, we can change things. We can figure out what actually matters to us, instead of what we think should matter. Watching them navigate this moment of vulnerability and honesty, I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't about apartments or careers or lifestyle choices. This was about fear and love and the complicated ways we protect ourselves from disappointment. Victoria, I said softly, I never wanted us to be in competition with each other. I just wanted to live my life without feeling like I had to apologize for it. She looked up at me, her mascara smudged, but her eyes clearer than they'd been all day. I'm sorry about what I said about your apartment. It really is beautiful. I was jealous, I think, jealous, that you seemed so sure of what you wanted, so comfortable with your choices. I'm not always sure, I admitted. I have doubts and fears just like everyone else, but I've learned that I'd rather be uncertain about my own path than certain about someone else's. Dad smiled at both of us, the expression warm and proud. Now that sounds like the kind of Easter miracle I can believe in. The rest of the afternoon unfolded differently than any of our family gatherings had in years. Instead of maintaining polite distance while navigating conversational landmines, we actually talked, really talked. Victoria asked questions about my job, my neighborhood, my friends, and for the first time in memory, she seemed genuinely interested in the answers, rather than just looking for ammunition for future critique. I, in turn, asked her about her real estate work, and discovered that she'd been quietly specializing in helping families find affordable housing, using her connections and knowledge to guide first-time buyers through a complex market. It was work she felt passionate about but rarely discussed because it wasn't as glamorous or lucrative as luxury sales. That's incredible, I told her as we sat in the backyard watching the kids hunt for Easter eggs. You're literally helping people achieve their dreams of homeownership. That's such meaningful work. It doesn't pay very well, she said, but there was pride in her voice. Marcus keeps telling me I should focus on higher-end properties, but I love working with young families. There's something so hopeful about helping someone buy their first home. Maybe that's what David was talking about, I said thoughtfully, about how success isn't just about accumulation. You're creating something valuable that goes beyond just making money. Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Madison carefully explain to Tyler why the plastic eggs weren't actually laid by a giant rabbit. Your David sounds like a wise man. He's not my David, I said, laughing. He's just someone who sees value in things that don't fit traditional definitions of success. Still, Victoria said with a small smile, any man who would defend my sister with that much passion is worth paying attention to. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and tried to change the subject, but Victoria was like a dog with a bone when she caught scent of something interesting. How long have you lived in his building? About a year. And in all that time, you've never thought about him as anything other than a landlord. I considered lying, but the honesty of the afternoon seemed to call for truth. I may have noticed that he's intelligent and kind and has really nice hands. Really nice hands. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. Rachel Torres, do you have a crush on your architect landlord? I don't have a crush, I protested, but even as I said it, I was remembering the way David had looked at me that morning, the passion in his voice when he'd defended my choices, the warmth in his eyes when he'd called my apartment one of his favorites. Ooh, my God, you totally do. Victoria was grinning now, looking more like the sister I remembered from childhood than she had in years. Ooh. And based on how he talked about you today, I'd say the feeling might be mutual.
That's ridiculous.
He was just being a good landlord. Rachel, honey, no landlord in the history of landlording has ever defended their tenants' life choices with that level of personal investment, unless there's something else going on. I wanted to argue, but Victoria had spent years honing her ability to read people, and her certainty was making me reconsider David's behavior that morning. Had there been something more than professional courtesy in the way he'd spoken about me, something more than landlord pride in the way he'd cataloged my contributions to the building community?
Ugh.
Even if that were true, I said carefully, it would be complicated. He's my landlord. There are power dynamics to consider. Victoria said with the kind of romantic optimism I'd forgotten she possessed. There are two adults who clearly care about each other, figuring out how to navigate a situation that started professionally, but has become something more. Before I could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Dinner's ready," he announced. "And Linda says to tell you both that the ham's getting cold." As we gathered around the familiar dining room table, I looked around at my family with new eyes. Dad carving ham with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Mom fussing over whether everyone had enough vegetables while secretly sneaking bites of dessert from the kitchen. Marcus helping Tyler cut his food while keeping up a running commentary about the Blazers' playoff chances. Victoria actually laughing at one of Dad's terrible jokes instead of politely tolerating it. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged here not as the sister who needed fixing or improving, but as myself. The realization was so profound it nearly brought tears to my eyes. After dinner, as we were clearing dishes, Victoria caught my arm. "Rachel, I owe you a real apology, not just for today, but for years of making you feel like your choices weren't valid. I think I've been so afraid of making the wrong decisions myself that I couldn't stand to see you making different ones and being happy. We've both made mistakes," I said, pulling her into a hug that felt genuine for the first time in memory. "But maybe we can do better going forward." "Maybe we can," she agreed. "And maybe you can invite me back to see your apartment sometime when I promise to behave myself." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Southeast Portland, I reflected on how dramatically the day had shifted. I'd started the morning dreading Victoria's judgment, and ended it feeling closer to my family than I had in years. But more than that, I'd discovered something about myself that I hadn't expected. I was done apologizing for who I was and what I wanted. The revelation felt powerful and slightly terrifying. If I stopped trying to be what others expected me to be, what would I become? What would I choose? And as Victoria's words about David echoed in my mind, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop playing it safe and start taking some risks on the things that mattered most. The lights of my building came into view as I turned onto my street, and I felt that familiar sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with square footage or property values, and everything to do with belonging. But tonight, there was something else mixed in with that contentment. Anticipation, like something important was about to begin, and for once I was ready to meet it head-on. The week following Easter brought an unexpected piece to my daily routine. For the first time in months, I wasn't dreading my phone buzzing with family drama or bracing myself for Victoria's latest critique disguised as concern. Instead, I found myself genuinely looking forward to her texts, which had shifted from passive-aggressive observations to actual conversations about work, life, and the small discoveries that make ordinary days memorable. Tuesday morning found me in the building's laundry room in the basement, sorting through a week's worth of clothes while mentally preparing for a client presentation that afternoon. The space was one of David's successful renovations, transformed from a dingy concrete cave into something almost cozy with warm lighting, painted walls, and a small seating area with mismatched chairs that tenants had gradually contributed over time. I was folding my favorite sweater when footsteps echoed down the stairs, followed by David's familiar voice calling out, "Rachel, are you down here?" My heart did something embarrassing that I chose to ignore as I turned toward the stairwell. "In the laundry room," I called back, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that I was wearing paint-stained jeans and an old college t-shirt. my hair twisted into a messy bun secured with what was probably a pencil. David appeared in the doorway carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes that somehow managed to look more put together than my carefully planned outfits. There was something different about his expression, more focused and determined than his usual easygoing demeanor. "I was hoping to catch you," he said, setting down the toolbox and running a hand through his hair in a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his tell when he was nervous about something. "I wanted to apologize for Sunday." I paused in my folding, genuinely confused. Apologize for what? For inserting myself into a family situation that wasn't really my business. I kept thinking about it afterward, worrying that I'd overstepped or made things more complicated for you. The concern in his voice made something warm unfurl in my chest. "David, you have nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should be thanking you for saying things I didn't know how to say myself." "Still," he said, moving closer to the folding table where I'd been working, "it occurred to me that I don't actually know much about your family dynamics and I may have misread the situation entirely." I looked at him, this man who had defended me with such passion to a virtual stranger, now second-guessing himself because he cared about my feelings. The thoughtfulness of it made my throat tight with emotion I wasn't quite ready to examine. "You didn't misread anything," I said carefully. "Victoria and I have a complicated relationship. We always have. She's not a bad person, but she has very specific ideas about what success looks like, and my choices don't fit her template." David leaned against the doorframe, his attention focused entirely on me in a way that made me feel simultaneously exposed and safe. "What changed? Because something definitely shifted between Sunday morning and when you left for your family dinner." The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. "How could you possibly know that?" "The way you carried yourself was different, more settled, I guess, like you'd made some kind of decision." I set down the shirt I'd been folding and really looked at him. "You're very observant for a landlord." "Maybe I'm observant about things that matter to me." The words hung between us, loaded with implications that made my pulse quick. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could change everything between us, and I found myself both terrified and exhilarated by the possibility. "David," I started, then stopped, unsure how to navigate whatever was happening. "I know," he said quietly, "this is complicated. Landlord, tenant, professional boundaries. I've been telling myself all week that I should just leave it alone. But I can't stop thinking about the way you looked when your sister was attacking everything you've built here, like you were shrinking into yourself, becoming small. And I couldn't stand it because everything about you, about the way you live, about what you've created in that apartment, is the opposite of small." My breath caught in my throat. "David, I'm not trying to put you in an uncomfortable position," he said quickly. "And I'm definitely not trying to abuse any kind of power dynamic. I just needed you to know that when I defended you Sunday, it wasn't just as your landlord, it was as someone who sees you, really sees you, and thinks you're extraordinary." The laundry room suddenly felt too small and too large at the same time. I was acutely aware of the washer humming in the background, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the way David's eyes never left mine as he waited for me to respond. "This is terrifying," I said honestly. "Good terrifying or bad terrifying?" I laughed, surprised by how natural it felt despite the gravity of the moment. "I'm not sure there's a difference." David smiled, and I noticed for the first time the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the fact that he had very nice hands, just as I'd admitted to Victoria. "Would it help if I told you I'm equally terrified?" he asked. "A little," I admitted. "What are you afraid of?" "Ruining something good, making you uncomfortable in your own home, discovering that whatever this is between us doesn't survive contact with reality." His honesty was disarming in the best possible way. "Those are all very reasonable fears. What about you? What's the terrifying part for you?" I considered the question seriously, sorting through the tangle of emotions that had been building since Sunday morning. "I'm afraid of wanting something I can't have. I'm afraid of being disappointed. I'm afraid that you see something in me that isn't really there." "Rachel," David said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been an architect for 25 years. I've spent my career learning to see what's really there, not what I want to see, or what someone tells me should be there. What I see when I look at you is someone who creates beauty wherever she goes, who builds community without even thinking about it, who makes everyone around her feel more at home in the world. The words hit me like a physical force, and I had to grip the edge of the folding table to steady myself. That's a lot of pressure to live up to. It's not pressure, he said, taking a step closer. It's recognition. There's a difference. We stood there looking at each other in the fluorescent-lit laundry room, surrounded by the mundane reality of washing machines and detergent bottles, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. Everything about the moment should have been ridiculous, but instead it felt perfect in its imperfection. So what do we do now? I asked finally. I don't know, David admitted. I've never been in this situation before, but I'd like to figure it out with you if you're willing. Before I could lose my nerve, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm and calloused from years of building and creating, and they closed around mine with a certainty that made my heart race. I'm willing. The smile that spread across David's face was worth every moment of uncertainty that had led to this point. In that case, he said, would you like to have dinner with me, somewhere that isn't a laundry room? I would love that, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a very long time. We were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, followed by Mrs. Thompson from 2A calling down, David, dear, are you down there? My bathroom faucet is acting up again. David squeezed my hand once before letting go, but the warmth lingered long after our fingers separated. Duty calls, he said with a regretful smile. But Rachel, Saturday night, if you're free, I'm free, I said, probably with more enthusiasm than was strictly dignified. After David left to attend to Mrs. Thompson's plumbing crisis, I stood alone in the laundry room, staring at my half-folded clothes, and trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain was already cataloging all the ways this could go wrong, all the complications and potential awkwardness that could arise from dating my landlord. But the larger part of me, the part that had been awakened by David's defense of my choices and his recognition of my worth, didn't care about rational objections. For once in my life I was going to choose what I wanted instead of what was safe. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anticipation and second-guessing. I found myself paying attention to David's movements around the building in ways I never had before, listening for his footsteps in the hallway, timing my trips to the mailbox to coincide with his afternoon round. It was ridiculous and teenage and wonderful, and I hadn't realized how much I'd missed feeling excited about the possibility of romance. Victoria, with her newly awakened interest in my personal life, proved to be an enthusiastic if overwhelming source of advice. She called Wednesday evening, ostensibly to discuss weekend plans for the kids, but quickly steered the conversation toward what she called the landlord situation. So have you talked to him since Sunday? She asked with the barely contained excitement of someone living vicariously through her sister's love life. We ran into each other in the laundry room yesterday, I said carefully, not ready to share the details of our conversation even with this new improved version of Victoria. And we're having dinner Saturday night. The squeal that came through the phone was so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. Rachel, this is huge. Where is he taking you? What are you going to wear? Have you thought about what this means for your living situation if things get serious? Victoria, slow down. It's just dinner. It's not just dinner and you know it. This is the man who defended your honor like something out of a romance novel. This is destiny, Rachel, or at least very promising romantic development. Despite myself, I found Victoria's enthusiasm infectious. It's one date, let's see how it goes before we start planning my wedding. Fine, but I'm going shopping with you for an outfit, and don't even think about arguing. Consider it my penance for being such a terrible sister all these years. Friday afternoon found us at Powell's Books, a choice that had seemed safe and sisterly until Victoria began treating our shopping trip like a military operation. She'd already dragged me through 3 clothing stores, dismissing my suggestions as either too casual or trying too hard with the authority of someone who had apparently appointed herself my romantic advisor. What about this? She asked, holding up a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. It's beautiful, I said honestly, but it's not me. I'd feel like I was wearing a costume. Victoria sighed and hung the dress back on the rack. You're right. I keep forgetting that the whole point is for him to see you, not some version of you designed to impress him. The insight surprised me with its wisdom. When did you become so smart about relationships? Somewhere between realizing my marriage needed work and watching you be brave enough to live authentically, she said with a self-deprecating smile. It turns out paying attention to other people's happiness can teach you things about your own. We ended up finding the perfect outfit at a vintage boutique in the Alberta district, a navy blue dress from the 1970s with a flowing skirt and fitted bodice that made me feel both comfortable and elegant. Victoria pronounced it absolutely perfect with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a challenging project. Now, she said as we walked back to our cars, promise me you'll call me Sunday morning with all the details. I promise, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. This new dynamic with Victoria, where she was invested in my happiness rather than threatened by it, felt precious and fragile, like something I needed to handle carefully. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of soft spring light that made Portland look like a painting. I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time getting ready, changing my mind about jewelry twice, and my lipstick 3 times before finally settling on a look that felt like myself but elevated. David had offered to pick me up, but I'd suggested meeting at the restaurant instead, partly because it felt less formal and partly because I needed the walk to calm my nerves. The place he'd chosen was a small Italian restaurant in the Pearl District, the kind of intimate neighborhood spot that served handmade pasta and had tables close enough that you could hear fragments of other diners' conversations without feeling like you were eavesdropping. I arrived 5 minutes early, a habit that usually served me well but left me sitting alone at our table with too much time to overthink everything. The restaurant was warm and dimly lit, with exposed brick walls that reminded me of my apartment and enough ambient noise to make conversation feel private. David appeared in the doorway exactly on time, and my breath caught in my throat. He was wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out the color of his eyes, and he'd obviously put thought into his appearance without looking like he'd tried too hard. When he spotted me across the restaurant, his face lit up with a smile that made my stomach flip in the best possible way. "You look beautiful," he said as he sat down across from me, and the simple sincerity of it made me blush like a teenager. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." The initial awkwardness I'd been dreading never materialized. Instead, conversation flowed as naturally as it had in the laundry room, covering everything from our respective weeks to our favorite books to the ongoing gentrification debates that shaped so much of Portland's cultural landscape. David was an engaged listener, asking follow-up questions that showed he was really paying attention, and his stories about architectural projects and building renovations were peppered with insights about community development and urban planning that revealed a thoughtful, principled approach to his work. "I have to ask," I said as we shared a plate of tiramisu that was almost too beautiful to eat, "what made you choose my building, out of all the properties you could have invested in?" David smiled, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "Honestly, it chose me. I'd been looking for the right project for months, something with good bones but enough character to be worth preserving. Most of the buildings I looked at were either too far gone or already so updated that there wasn't anything meaningful left to restore." He paused, and I could see him remembering. "But when I walked through your building for the first time, I could feel what it had been, all those artist studios, all the creative energy that had lived in those spaces. The building had this sense of possibility, like it was waiting for someone to recognize its potential. And now it's becoming what it was always meant to be, a place where creative people can afford to live and work, where community happens naturally, where the past and present can coexist without one destroying the other." The passion in his voice reminded me of the way he'd defended my apartment to Victoria, and I realized that what I'd interpreted as personal investment in my well-being was actually part of a larger philosophy about how people should be able to live in the world. "Is that why you defended me so fiercely to Victoria?" I asked. "Because I represented something about your vision for the building?" David set down his wine glass and looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "No," he said simply. "I defended you because watching someone diminish your joy was unbearable to me. The building, the community, the larger philosophy about urban development, all of that mattered, but in that moment, what mattered most was that someone I care about was being made to feel small." The words hung between us, loaded with implications that made the restaurant feel suddenly intimate, despite the crowd of other diners around us. "Someone you care about," I repeated softly, "someone I care about very much." David confirmed, his eyes never leaving mine. Someone I've been thinking about since the day she wrote me a letter about what living in my building would mean to her. You remember my application letter? I remember everything about your application letter. The way you described wanting to honor the building's history while making it your home, the photographs you included of your previous apartment, showing how you'd transformed a generic space into something personal and beautiful, the careful way you talked about community and belonging. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I was so nervous writing that letter. I wanted the apartment so badly, and I was sure you'd choose someone with better credit or a more stable job history. Rachel, David said, reaching across the table to take my hand, you were exactly what I was looking for. Not just as a tenant, but as the kind of person who would help create the community I envisioned for that building. His thumb traced circles across my knuckles, and I found myself wondering how something so simple could feel so intimate. What happens now? I asked, echoing the question I'd posed in the laundry room. Now, David said with a smile that made my heart race, we see where this goes. If you want to, I want to, I said without hesitation. I'm terrified, but I want to. Good, David said, squeezing my hand gently. Because I've been thinking about kissing you since Sunday morning, and I'm hoping I get the chance to do that soon.
The confession made my breath catch in my throat. You could do that now, I said, surprised by my own boldness. David's eyes darkened with something that made my stomach flip. I could, he agreed, but I'd rather do it properly. Somewhere that isn't a restaurant full of strangers. The promise in his voice made anticipation coil low in my belly. My apartment isn't far from here. I know exactly how far your apartment is from here, David said with a smile that was part affection, part desire. The question is whether you're ready for what happens when we cross that particular line. I thought about the question seriously, considering all the ways this could complicate my life, all the potential awkwardness and professional entanglements that could arise. Then I thought about the way David had seen me, really seen me, and defended what I'd built with a passion that suggested his feelings ran deeper than landlord appreciation. I'm ready, I said, and meant it completely. David signaled for the check with a gesture that managed to be both urgent and patient, and I found myself admiring the way he navigated even simple interactions with thoughtfulness and grace. As we waited for our server, he told me about a restoration project he was considering, a 1940s apartment building in Southeast that had been neglected for decades but still retained its original architectural details. It would be a huge undertaking, he said, his enthusiasm evident despite the practical challenges he outlined. But buildings like that, they have stories to tell. They've housed generations of families, witnessed countless moments of joy and sorrow and ordinary daily life. When you restore something like that, you're not just preserving architecture, you're preserving memory. Listening to him talk about his work, I realized that David approached building renovation the way I approached photography, as a means of capturing and honoring moments that might otherwise be lost. The recognition created a sense of kinship that went beyond attraction, a feeling that we understood something fundamental about each other's relationship to the world. The walk back to my building was charged with anticipation and nervous energy. David had offered to drive me, but I'd suggested walking instead, partly because the evening was beautiful, and partly because I needed the movement to channel some of the excitement coursing through my system. We talked as we walked, but I was hyper-aware of every brush of his hand against mine, every moment when our shoulders bumped as we navigated sidewalk obstacles. I have to confess something, David said, as we turned onto my street. I've been looking forward to seeing your apartment again, but under very different circumstances than last time. No judgmental family members this time, I agreed. Just us, he repeated, and the words sounded like a prompt. The building's lobby felt different as we entered together, charged with possibility rather than routine. David's key still worked in the main door, of course, but using it while I was with him felt significant somehow, like a small boundary being crossed. As we climbed the stairs to my floor, I found myself seeing the space through his architect's eyes, noticing details I usually overlooked, the way the original stair railing had been preserved and restored, the careful attention to period-appropriate lighting fixtures, the overall sense that modern conveniences had been integrated without compromising the building's character. You really did an amazing job with this renovation, I said, as we reached my floor. Thank you, David said, but his attention was focused entirely on me now, not on the building around us. Though I have to say, the real test of any renovation is how it feels to live in, whether it becomes a home or just remains a space. I unlocked my apartment door with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware of David's presence behind me. The familiar space looked different in the evening light, more intimate somehow, and I felt a flutter of nervousness about how the evening would unfold. Would you like some wine? I asked, moving toward the kitchen, partly out of hospitality, and partly to give myself something to do with my hands. In a minute, David said softly, and when I turned around, he was standing closer than I'd expected, his eyes serious and intent. First, I'd like to do what I've been thinking about all week. What's that? I asked, though I thought I knew. Instead of answering, David reached up and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing gentle lines across my cheekbone. The touch was so tender and deliberate that I felt tears prick my eyes. I'd like to kiss you, he said quietly. If that's okay, that's very okay, I whispered, and then his lips were on mine, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss started gentle, almost hesitant, but deepened as I responded, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt to pull him closer. David tasted like wine and possibility, and when we finally broke apart, I was breathless and wanting more. That was worth waiting for, he said against my forehead, his voice rough with emotion. Definitely worth waiting for, I agreed, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt perfectly at home in my own skin, in my own space, with someone who saw me exactly as I was and found me worthy of protection, passion, and care. The morning sun streamed through my apartment windows with unusual brightness, casting everything in a golden glow that matched my inexplicably buoyant mood. I lay in bed for an extra few minutes, replaying the previous evening in vivid detail, the way David's eyes had lit up when he saw me at the restaurant, the natural flow of conversation that had carried us through dinner, the perfect moment when he'd kissed me in my living room, with a tenderness that had left me breathless and wanting more. We'd spent hours talking after that first kiss, curled together on my vintage couch with glasses of wine that went largely untouched as we discovered the particular intimacy of late-night conversation. David had told me about his childhood in Seattle, growing up the son of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they'd never had. I'd shared stories about my photography, the way capturing light and shadow helped me make sense of the world, and how living in this apartment had taught me the difference between space and home. He'd left around midnight with another kiss that had lasted long enough to make my knees weak, and a promise to call me today. As I finally dragged myself out of bed and toward the coffee maker, I found myself humming for the first time in months, feeling lighter than I had since moving to Portland. My phone buzzed as I was preparing breakfast, and Victoria's name appeared on the screen with impeccable timing. Details, she demanded without preamble. I've been awake since 6 thinking about your date, and I need to know everything immediately. I laughed, settling into my kitchen chair with my coffee. Good morning to you too, Victoria. Morning. Details. Now, how was dinner? Did he kiss you? Are you seeing him again? Slow down, I said, though I was secretly delighted by her enthusiasm. Dinner was wonderful. He was wonderful. Yes, he kissed me. And yes, I'm seeing him again. The squeal that came through the phone was so loud my upstairs neighbor probably heard it. I knew it. I absolutely knew this would happen. There was something about the way he looked at you when he was defending your apartment. You could practically see the hearts floating around his head. Victoria, you're being ridiculous. I'm being romantic, which is completely different. Tell me about the kiss. I'm not telling you about the kiss. Was it good though? On a scale of disappointing peck to earth-shattering romantic revelation. I considered the question seriously, remembering the way David's hands had felt cupping my face, the gentle pressure of his lips, the way the world had seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. Closer to earth-shattering, I admit. I'm so happy I could cry, Victoria said, and she actually sounded like she might. Rachel, you deserve this. You deserve someone who sees how incredible you are. The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. So what happens now? Are you going to see him today? I don't know. He said he'd call, but I don't want to seem too eager. Rachel, honey, you're dating your landlord. The normal rules about playing hard to get don't really apply here. Besides, life's too short to pretend you're not excited about someone who makes you happy. Her words carried a wisdom that surprised me, and I found myself wondering when Victoria had become so insightful about matters of the heart. We talked for another 20 minutes, Victoria extracting every detail I was willing to share about the previous evening, while offering unsolicited but surprisingly helpful advice about navigating the early stages of what she'd already dubbed the most romantic meet-cute in Torres family history. After we hung up, I found myself restless with anticipation. Sunday stretched ahead of me with no concrete plans, and the uncertainty of when David might call was making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. I decided to channel my nervous energy into productivity, tackling the pile of freelance photography editing I'd been putting off all week. I was deep in post-processing when a knock at my door interrupted my concentration. My heart leaped with the possibility that it might be David, but when I opened the door, I found Mrs. Thompson from 2A, holding a plate of what appeared to be homemade scones. "Rachel, dear," she said with the warm smile that had made her one of my favorite neighbors since moving in. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I made far too many scones this morning, and I thought you might enjoy some." "That's so thoughtful, Mrs. Thompson. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "Oh, I don't want to impose, but if you're sure you don't mind." I ushered her inside, grateful for the distraction and genuine company. Eleanor Thompson was in her 70s, a retired librarian, who had lived in the building longer than anyone else, and served as its unofficial historian. She had a gift for knowing exactly when someone needed a friendly face and a listening ear. As I prepared coffee, Mrs. Thompson settled into my armchair with the familiarity of someone who felt comfortable in my space. "You seem particularly cheerful today," she observed with the perceptiveness that had probably made her an excellent librarian. "I had a nice evening," I said carefully, not sure how much I wanted to reveal about my personal life. "With our David, perhaps." I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "How did you, my dear? I saw you two leave together last night, and you both had that particular glow people get when they're quite taken with each other. It was rather lovely to witness." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but Miss Thompson's expression was so genuinely pleased that I couldn't bring myself to be embarrassed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been observing human nature for 7 decades, she said with a gentle laugh, "and to someone who's been hoping something might develop between you two for months." "You've been hoping?" "Oh yes, David is such a good man, but he's been rather lonely since his divorce was finalized. And you, my dear, have such a generous spirit, but you've seemed somewhat isolated since moving in. It occurred to me that you might complement each other quite nicely." The revelation that Mrs. Thompson had been quietly matchmaking was both touching and amusing. "How long have you been planning this?" "I wasn't planning anything exactly, but I may have mentioned to David on several occasions what a lovely tenant you are, and I may have mentioned to you how dedicated he is to creating a real community in this building. Sometimes people just need a gentle nudge to see what's right in front of them." I laughed, shaking my head in amazement. "You're quite the strategist, Mrs. Thompson." "I prefer to think of myself as a facilitator of happiness," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "And speaking of happiness, I do hope you know what a fortunate woman you are. David is the kind of man who doesn't give his heart easily, but when he does, it's completely and forever." The weight of her words settled over me like a blessing and a responsibility. "It's still very new," I said carefully. "The best things usually are. But I've seen the way he looks at you, dear. That man is quite thoroughly smitten." We spent the next hour discussing everything from Miss Thompson's late husband to her thoughts on the changing neighborhood to her theories about which of our fellow tenants might benefit from similar romantic intervention. Her presence was exactly what I needed to calm my nerves about the newness of whatever was developing with David. After she left, I returned to my editing work with renewed focus, losing myself in the meditative process of adjusting light and shadow until the images captured exactly what I'd seen through my camera lens. I was working on a series of photographs from a recent trip to the Oregon coast, trying to convey the particular quality of light that occurred just before sunset, when my phone rang. David's name on the caller ID made my pulse quicken with anticipation. "Hi," I said, probably with more enthusiasm than was strictly cool. Hi yourself, David replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. How's your Sunday going? Better now, I said honestly. I was just working on some photography editing. What about you? I've been thinking about last night, he said, his voice taking on a warmer tone that made my stomach flutter, and about how much I'd like to see you again soon. How soon? Well, I'm supposed to be reviewing contractor bids for the building's exterior painting project, but I keep getting distracted by thoughts of a certain tenant who looked absolutely beautiful in candlelight last night. The compliment made me blush even though he couldn't see me. That sounds like a serious problem. Maybe you need a break from work. I was thinking the same thing. Any chance you'd be interested in taking a walk? The weather's perfect, and I know some hidden spots in the neighborhood that most tourists never find. I'd love that, I said without hesitation. Great. Give me 20 minutes to finish up this paperwork and I'll come get you. After we hung up, I found myself moving through my apartment with the particular energy that comes from anticipating something wonderful. I changed into more comfortable walking shoes and grabbed a light jacket, then spent several minutes in front of the mirror trying to achieve the perfect balance of looking put together without appearing like I'd tried too hard. David's knock came exactly 20 minutes later, and when I opened the door, he was holding 2 cups from the coffee shop down the street, and wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater that made his eyes look impossibly blue. I thought you might want caffeine for our adventure, he said, offering me one of the cups. You thought correctly, I said, accepting the coffee, and noting that he'd somehow remembered exactly how I liked it, prepared. The afternoon unfolded like a perfect dream. David led me through parts of Southeast Portland I'd never explored, sharing stories about the neighborhood's history, and pointing out architectural details I would have missed on my own. We wandered through the tree-lined streets of Ladd's Addition, with its diagonal spoke pattern and historic homes, then made our way to the hidden rose garden tucked behind an unassuming community center. I discovered this place by accident, David explained as we settled onto a bench surrounded by roses that were just beginning to bloom. I was meeting a client about a renovation project, got lost trying to find the address, and stumbled across this garden. I've been coming here to think ever since. It's magical, I said, looking around at the carefully tended beds and the way afternoon light filtered through the surrounding trees. I can't believe I've lived in this neighborhood for a year and never knew this existed. That's the thing about cities, David said, shifting closer to me on the bench. There are always secret places waiting to be discovered. You just have to be open to finding them. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about gardens, and when I looked at him, I found him studying my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. Is that what we're doing? I asked softly, discovering secret place. Maybe, David said, reaching over to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. Would that be okay with you? Instead of answering with words, I leaned forward and kissed him, right there in the secret garden with roses blooming around us, and the sound of the city distant and muffled. This kiss was different from the one in my apartment, the night before, less hesitant and more certain, carrying with it the promise of whatever was beginning to grow between us. When we broke apart, David rested his forehead against mine, his hand still cupped around my face. I have to confess something, he said, quietly. What's that? I've been thinking about you for months, long before Easter, long before your sister's visit. Every time I saw you in the building, every time we had those brief conversations in the hallway, I found myself hoping for reasons to talk to you longer. The admission sent warmth spreading through my chest. Why didn't you say anything? Because you were my tenant, and I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. Because I wasn't sure if what I was feeling was appropriate or reciprocated. Because sometimes the most important things are the scariest to risk. I understood exactly what he meant. I was attracted to you too, I admitted, but I convinced myself it was just because you were kind and intelligent and had really nice hands. David laughed, looking down at the hands in question. Really nice hands? Really nice hands, I confirmed, taking one of them in both of mine. Among other qualities. What other qualities? Well, you defend people when they need defending. You see beauty in things other people overlook. You make coffee exactly the way I like it without being told. You create spaces where people can feel at home. Those are pretty good qualities for a landlord to have, David said, with a smile. They're even better qualities for a boyfriend to have, I said, then immediately felt my cheeks burn at the presumption. Boyfriend, David repeated, but his eyes were twinkling with amusement, rather than alarm. I mean, if that's something you might be interested in, eventually, when we figure out how to navigate the whole landlord-tenant thing. Rachel, David said, his voice suddenly serious. I would be very interested in being your boyfriend, more than interest. And as for navigating the complications, I think we're both adults, who can handle whatever challenges come up. The certainty in his voice made something settle into place inside me, a sense of rightness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the neighborhood, stopping at a used bookstore where David bought me a vintage photography book he thought I'd enjoy, then grabbing dinner at a tiny Vietnamese restaurant that served the best food I'd ever tasted. Conversation flowed effortlessly between us, covering everything from our respective career aspirations, to our favorite travel destinations, to our thoughts on whether Portland's reputation for weirdness was deserved or overblown. As evening approached, we found ourselves back at the building, reluctant to end what had been a perfect day. We lingered in the lobby, making excuses to extend our time together until Mrs. Thompson appeared on her way to check the mail. Good evening, you two, she said with a knowing smile. Lovely day for a walk, wasn't it? Beautiful day, David agreed, his hand finding mine with natural ease. The building feels different when its residents are happy, Mrs. Thompson observed with the satisfied air of someone whose matchmaking efforts had succeeded. More like home. After she disappeared into the mailroom, David and I looked at each other and burst into laughter. I think we've been thoroughly managed, I said. By a master, David agreed. Remind me to send her flowers. We climbed the stairs together, our footsteps echoing in the quiet building. When we reached my floor, David walked me to my door like a proper gentleman, though the heat in his eyes suggested his thoughts were anything but proper. Thank you for today, I said, fishing for my keys while trying to ignore the way David was looking at my mouth. Thank you for saying yes to the walk, and to dinner, and to whatever this is becoming between us. What do you think it's becoming? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. David considered the question seriously, his architect's mind probably cataloging possibilities and potential outcomes. Something real, he said finally, something worth building carefully and protecting once it's built. The construction metaphor made me smile. You really do see everything in terms of architecture, don't you? Not everything, David said, stepping closer until I was backed against my apartment door. But the important things, yes, and you, Rachel Torres, are definitely something important.
Before I could respond, he was kissing me again. And this time there was nothing hesitant about it. His hands tangled in my hair, and I could taste the promise of everything we were building together in the urgency of his mouth against mine. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, and I could see desire darkening David's eyes to navy blue. I should go, he said, though he made no move to step away from me. You should, I agreed, though what I really wanted was to invite him inside and see where the evening led us. But I don't want to. I don't want you to either. We stood there in the hallway, caught between want and wisdom, until David finally took a step back with what appeared to be considerable effort. This is moving fast, he said, running a hand through his hair in that gesture I was learning meant he was trying to think clearly. Is that bad? Not bad, just significant. I want to do this right, Rachel. I want to build something with you that lasts. The thoughtfulness behind his restraint made me fall a little harder for him. I want that too. Good, David said, his smile soft and full of promise. In that case, I'll see you tomorrow. Maybe we can have coffee before work. I'd like that very much. After he left, I leaned against my closed door and tried to process the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. In the span of 24 hours, my carefully ordered life had been turned upside down in the best possible way. I was falling for a man who saw me clearly and valued what he saw, who defended my choices and supported my dreams, who kissed me like I was precious and rare. For someone who had spent most of her adult life convinced she was too much or not enough, the experience of being appreciated exactly as I was felt revolutionary. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Sweet dreams, beautiful. Thank you for the perfect day. I typed back. Thank you for seeing me. His response came immediately.
Impossible not to. As I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by what I saw. The woman looking back at me was radiant, her eyes bright with possibility and her smile impossible to suppress. She looked like someone who had finally found her place in the world, someone who was ready to stop playing it safe and start embracing everything life had to offer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications. Questions about how to navigate a relationship with my landlord and what it might mean for my living situation if things went wrong. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, I was simply a woman who had been kissed by someone wonderful in a secret garden, who had spent the day discovering hidden corners of the city with a man who made her feel seen and valued and cherished. It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, I stood in the same laundry room where David had first told me he cared about me, but this time I wasn't alone. Victoria was helping me fold clothes while regaling me with stories from her latest real estate success, her voice animated in a way that had become natural since our Easter reconciliation. So the first-time buyers were absolutely convinced they couldn't afford anything in this market, she was saying, shaking out one of my vintage band t-shirts with the careful attention she now paid to things that mattered to me. But I knew there was a perfect little bungalow in Woodstock that had been sitting on the market because everyone was scared of the renovation work needed. 3 weeks later, their homeowners with equity built in from day one. That's amazing, I said, genuinely proud of how she'd transformed her real estate career into something meaningful. You're changing people's lives. I'm just helping them see possibilities they didn't know existed, Victoria replied, then paused in her folding to give me a pointed look. Speaking of which, have you and David talked about the future yet? I nearly dropped the sheet I was folding. Victoria, what? You've been together for 3 months. You're practically living together already, considering how much time he spends in your apartment. It's a reasonable question. She wasn't wrong about the practically living together part. David had gradually become a constant presence in my life, bringing coffee in the mornings before work, staying for dinner most evenings, and falling asleep on my couch more often than not after late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. His clothes had begun appearing in my laundry, his books were scattered among mine on the coffee table, and he'd somehow accumulated a drawer in my dresser without either of us officially discussing it. We're taking things as they come, I said, which was true if not entirely complete. Rachel, the man looked at engagement rings with Marcus last weekend. I dropped the sheet entirely this time. He what? Victoria's eyes widened as she realized she'd revealed something she wasn't supposed to know. I wasn't supposed to tell you. Victoria Torres, you tell me everything right now. Marcus wasn't supposed to tell me, and I definitely wasn't supposed to tell you. They ran into each other at the jewelry district downtown, and David mentioned he was browsing, and Marcus may have offered to help him pick out something perfect for someone with your taste. The words hung in the air between us, while I processed what she was saying. David was looking at engagement rings. For me, the thought should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a warmth that started in my chest and spread outward until I felt like I might float away. Oh my God, I said, sinking onto one of the mismatched chairs Miss Thompson had contributed to the laundry room's eclectic decor. Are you freaking out? You look like you're freaking out. Please don't freak out, because Marcus will kill me if David finds out I ruined some romantic surprise he's planned. I'm not freaking out, I said slowly, testing the truth of the statement. I think I'm the opposite of freaking out, which is completely and utterly happy. Victoria's face broke into the kind of smile that reminded me why I'd loved her so fiercely as a child, before competition and insecurity had complicated our relationship. Really? Really? Victoria, I love him. I'm in love with him in a way that feels like coming home and going on an adventure at the same time. If he wants to marry me, I can't imagine saying anything but yes. Even though it means being married to your landlord. I laughed, remembering how complicated that had seemed just a few months ago, especially because it means being married to my landlord. Do you know what it's like to be in love with someone who's dedicated his career to creating spaces where people can feel at home? Every day I get to see him make other people's lives better, and every night I get to fall asleep next to the person who makes me feel most like myself. That's disgustingly romantic, Victoria said with obvious delight. I love. We finished the laundry in companionable silence, both of us lost in our respective thoughts. As we climbed the stairs back to my apartment, Victoria paused on the landing. "You know what I realized the other day?" That Easter morning when I called your apartment a dump, I wasn't really talking about your home, I was talking about my own life." I stopped walking and turned to look at her fully. "What do you I mean, I was standing in your beautiful creative space that you'd built with intention and love, and all I could see was what it lacked compared to my house. But what I was really seeing was what my life lacked compared to yours. Purpose, authenticity, joy in the everyday moment." The honesty in her voice made my throat tight with emotion. "Victoria, I'm not finished," she said with a small smile. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me that day, for fighting back when I attacked what you'd built, for showing me that there's more than one way to measure success. We've both learned things," I said softly. "Yes, but you learned them first, and you were brave enough to live them even when people like me made you question yourself." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the stairwell below us, followed by David's voice calling my name. "Up here," I called back, my pulse quickening at the sound of his approach. David appeared around the corner, carrying a bouquet of roses from the secret garden where we'd first kissed, and wearing an expression that was equal parts nervous excitement and determined purpose. "Hi," he said, his eyes finding mine immediately. "Victoria, nice to see you." "Hi, David," Victoria replied with a knowing smile. "I was just leaving, actually. Marcus is making dinner tonight, and I promised to pick up wine on the way home." She hugged me goodbye, whispering, "Be happy," in my ear, then kissed David's cheek and practically skipped down the stairs. Her obvious delight in whatever she thought was about to happen made David's nervous energy even more apparent. "Everything okay?" I asked as we entered my apartment. "Everything's perfect," David said, setting the roses on my kitchen counter with careful precision. "Or it will be, if you say yes to something I want to ask you." My heart started beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "What do you want to ask me?" Instead of answering immediately, David took my hands in his and looked at me with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "Rachel, 3 months ago you changed my life by letting me see what home really means. Not just a building or a space, but a feeling of belonging so complete that everything else falls into place around it." I felt tears prick my eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "You've taught me that the most beautiful structures aren't the ones that impress people from the outside, but the ones that nurture the people living inside them. You've shown me what it means to build a life with intention and creativity and joy." "David," I whispered, overwhelmed by the love I could see in his eyes. "I know we haven't been together very long," he continued, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to spend every day learning new things about you. I want to build a future with you that's as beautiful and authentic as what you've created in this apartment. I want to grow old with you in spaces we designed together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made my breath catch in my throat. "Rachel Torres, will you marry me?" The ring was perfect. A vintage Art Deco setting with a stone that caught the afternoon light streaming through my windows and threw rainbows across the wall. It was elegant and unique and completely suited to my taste, clearly chosen by someone who really saw me. "Yes," I said, without hesitation, laughing through the tears that were now flowing freely. "Yes, of course. Yeah." David's face broke into a smile so radiant it could have powered the entire building as he slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook slightly. Then he was kissing me, with a passion that tasted like celebration and promise and the kind of love that builds foundations strong enough to last a lifetime. When we finally broke apart, I held up my hand to admire the ring, watching the way it caught the light and made everything around it seem to sparkle. "It's perfect," I said. "How did you know exactly what I'd want?" "I pay attention," David said simply. "I notice everything about you, Rach. The way you hold your coffee cup, the way you arrange flowers, the way you see beauty in unexpected places." Choosing a ring was just about finding something as unique and radiant as you are. "I love you," I said, the words carrying with them the weight of absolute certainty. "I love you so much it sometimes scares me." "Don't be scared," David said, cupping my face in his hands. We're building something strong enough to weather whatever comes. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and celebration. My parents cried with joy when we called to share the news. Dad immediately beginning to plan how he'd walk me down the aisle, and Mom already worrying about guest lists and catering. Victoria and Marcus arrived with champagne and an enthusiasm that was infectious. Victoria claiming credit for the entire romance while Marcus good-naturedly endured her victory lap. Miss Thompson appeared at my door with a bottle of wine that she claimed had been waiting in her apartment for exactly this occasion, and soon half the building had gathered in my small space to toast the engagement. Jake from 3B brought his guitar, the couple from 1A contributed homemade cookies, and even the usually reclusive artist from the top floor emerged to offer congratulations. As I looked around my apartment filled with neighbors who had become friends, at Victoria and Marcus arguing good-naturedly about wedding venue options, at David moving easily through the crowd and making everyone feel welcome, I realized that somewhere along the way I'd stopped simply living in this building and started belonging to a community. "This is what you envisioned, isn't it?" I asked David later after everyone had gone home and we were cleaning up glasses and plates. "When you bought this building, this is what you hoped it would become." "This is better than what I envisioned," David said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the kitchen sink. "I imagined a place where people could feel at home. I didn't imagine falling in love with one of my tenants and discovering what home really means." "So what happens now?" I asked, leaning back against his chest. "Do I get a discount on rent for marrying the landlord?" David laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "I was thinking more along the lines of converting the apartment upstairs into a larger unit. Knock down some walls, create a real kitchen, maybe add a dedicated workspace for your photography." The casual way he mentioned renovating the building to accommodate our future made my heart skip. "You'd do that? Rachel, I'd build you an entire house from scratch if that's what you want." Though I have to say, there's something poetic about staying in the place where we fell in love. "There is," I agreed, thinking about all the moments that had led us to this point. "This apartment saved me in a lot of ways. It taught me the difference between what I thought I should want and what actually makes me happy." "What makes you happy?" David asked, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. I considered the question, looking around the space that had become so much more than just where I lived. The exposed brick walls that had witnessed my tears and laughter, the vintage furniture that told stories of previous owners, the gallery wall of photographs that captured moments of beauty I'd discovered throughout the city, the orchid David had brought me that first Easter morning now thriving on my windowsill. "This," I said simply, "creating something beautiful with someone I love, building a life that feels true to who we are rather than who we think we should be, having a place that's ours, where we can welcome people and make them feel at home." "Then that's what we'll build," David said, with the certainty of someone who had made a career of turning visions into reality. "Together," I added. "Together," he agreed. 6 months later, I stood in the same apartment where David had first defended my choices to Victoria, but the space had been transformed. The wall between my unit and the one upstairs had been carefully removed to create a 2-story loft that maintained all the original architectural details while doubling our living space. The new kitchen featured a restored vintage stove and custom cabinets made from reclaimed wood, and the upper level housed a dedicated photography studio with north-facing windows that provided perfect natural light. Victoria was there again, but this time she was helping me get ready for my wedding, carefully fastening the vintage pearl buttons on the back of my dress while offering a steady stream of encouragement and only occasionally emotional commentary. "You look absolutely radiant," she said, stepping back to admire her handiwork, "like someone who's exactly where she belongs." "I feel like someone who's exactly where she belongs," I replied, smoothing the flowing skirt of my dress. We'd chosen to have the ceremony in the building's courtyard garden surrounded by the community that had become our extended family. "I'm proud of you," Victoria said suddenly, her voice serious, "for choosing love over fear, for teaching me that there's more than one way to build a meaningful life, for never giving up on us even when I was too stubborn to see what was right in front of me." "I'm proud of you too," I said, meaning it completely, "for having the courage to change, for finding work that fulfills you, for becoming the sister I always knew you could be." A knock at the door interrupted our moment, and Dad's voice called through the wood, "Is everyone decent in there?" It's time for a father to see his daughter in her wedding dress. Come in, Dad, I called, and when he entered the apartment, the expression on his face made my eyes fill with tears I was desperately trying not to shed for the sake of my makeup. "Oh, sweetheart," he said softly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen." "Don't make me cry," I warned, fanning my face with my hands. "Too late," Victoria said, dabbing at her own eyes with a tissue. "We're all crying now." Through the windows I could see guests gathering in the courtyard below. Miss Thompson was directing the arrangement of chairs with the authority of someone who had appointed herself wedding coordinator, while other neighbors contributed flowers from their own gardens and strung lights between the trees. David appeared in the courtyard wearing a navy suit that made him look impossibly handsome, and when he looked up at my window his face broke into a smile so brilliant I felt it in my bones. "That man loves you completely," Dad observed, following my gaze. "I love him completely too," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd ever said. The ceremony was everything I'd dreamed of and nothing like I'd originally planned. Instead of a traditional church wedding, we exchanged vows under the canopy of oak trees in our building's garden, surrounded by the people who had become our chosen family. Mrs. Thompson read a poem about love and architecture that made everyone cry, and Jake from 3B played guitar while we signed the marriage certificate on a table made from the same reclaimed wood as our kitchen cabinet. When David kissed me as his wife for the first time, the entire courtyard erupted in cheers and applause, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Later, as the reception wound down and guests began to drift away, David and I found ourselves alone in our transformed apartment, still wearing our wedding clothes and grinning at each other like teenagers. "So," David said, pulling me into his arms, "how does it feel to be married to your landlord?" "Like the best decision I've ever made," I replied without hesitation, "even though I can never evict you now, especially because you can never evict me." As we swayed together in our living room, surrounded by wedding gifts and the lingering scent of roses from the garden, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The scared woman who had moved into this apartment a year ago, convinced she was failing at life because she couldn't fit into someone else's definition of success, felt like a different person entirely. I'd learned that home isn't measured in square footage or property values, but in the love and intention you bring to a space. I'd discovered that family isn't just about blood relations, but about the people who see you clearly and choose to support your dream. Most importantly, I'd found that the courage to be authentically yourself is the greatest gift you can give to the people who matter most. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing my contemplative mood. "Just how different my life is now compared to a year ago. How different I am." "You're not that different," David said thoughtfully. "You're just finally living as yourself instead of as who you thought you should be. Is that what love does? Makes you brave enough to be real?" "The right love does," David said, spinning me around our living room with the confidence of someone who had found his perfect partner. "The right love sees who you really are and says yes, that person, exactly as they are." As midnight approached and we finally changed out of our wedding clothes, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was radiant with happiness, confident in her choices, secure in her place in the world. She looked like someone who had found her home, both in a place and in a person. The orchid David had brought me that first Easter morning still sat on the windowsill, now joined by several others and surrounded by photographs from our courtship and wedding day. It had bloomed 3 times in the months since we'd been together, as if drawing strength from the love that filled our space. "Ready for bed, Mrs. Chen?" David asked, using my new name for the first time. "Ready for everything," I replied, and meant it with my whole heart. As we settled into our bed in our renovated apartment in our community-filled building, I reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led me here. Victoria's cruel words on Easter morning had been meant to diminish me, but instead, they had catalyzed a transformation that brought me everything I'd never known I want. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and the most beautiful futures grow from the courage to defend what you've built with your own hands and heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.